There is a question that has been asked in rooms of consequence for as long as consequence has existed. It has been asked by kings and politicians and executives and celebrities and people of such specific and concentrated fame that their names function less like names and more like institutions. It has been asked in restaurants and airports and backstage corridors and private clubs and occasionally in courtrooms, though the courtroom is perhaps the least suitable environment for it that exists, because the courtroom is precisely the room that was designed to make the question irrelevant. Do you know who I am? 4 words that contain an entire philosophy. 4 words that assume the answer is yes, and that the yes will produce something, will open something, will soften something that needs to remain hard. 4 words that have worked in enough places, enough times, that the person asking them has forgotten that they do not work everywhere. That there are rooms where the question lands and produces not accommodation, but something closer to its opposite. Kayla Monroe was 27 years old. She had built something that previous generations would have had no framework for, and that her own generation accepted as entirely ordinary, a life and a career constructed entirely from the architecture of attention. She had begun posting content online at 19, initially about fashion, and then about travel, and then about the particular texture of her own daily existence. The meals and the mornings and the relationships and the thoughts, all of it curated and lit and captioned and released into a digital ecosystem that had responded with an enthusiasm that compounded over time. By 22, she had 1 million followers. By 25, she had 11 million. By 27, she had 18 million people who checked in with her life regularly, who felt they knew her, who bought things she mentioned and went places she described, and in some cases made significant decisions about their own lives based on the impression her content created. That was real, not in the way that building a bridge was real or performing surgery was real, but real in the sense that it had genuine effects on real people, real economic weight, real cultural reach. She had understood something about human attention and human connection and the specific hunger people had for intimacy at scale, and she had built something from that understanding that functioned in the world. The money was real. The influence was real. The relationships with brands and platforms and media companies were real. She had done something that most people who tried to do it could not do and had sustained it for years, which was the harder achievement, the one that separated the briefly visible from the genuinely established. She was in Providence because she was on a road trip along the New England coast, documenting it for her audience. The trip itself had generated significant engagement, the kind of organic story arc that her audience responded to, the spontaneity of it, the sense of genuine discovery rather than produced content. She had been in the city for 2 days. She had posted about the waterfront and the architecture, and a restaurant that had subsequently seen its reservation wait list grow by 300% overnight, which was a real thing she did to real places just by pointing a phone at them. She had 3 citations. The first was for parking in a restricted zone outside a historic building while she filmed content. The second was for the same violation at a different location the following morning. The third was for blocking a public footpath with equipment, which her team had set up for a filming sequence in a way that had made the path impassable for a period of approximately 40 minutes. A complaint had been filed by a resident who used that path daily for a mobility reason and who had been forced to navigate a significantly longer alternative route. She came to court with her phone pointed at herself. This was not a metaphor. She was filming her arrival, narrating quietly to the camera as she walked through the entrance, describing the setting, the feeling, the spontaneity of finding herself in a Providence courtroom. It was content. The court appearance was content. A court officer approached her immediately and informed her that recording inside the courtroom was not permitted. She looked at him with the practiced patience of someone who was used to encountering rules they considered excessive and said she was just documenting her day. The officer said the rule applied regardless of the purpose of the recording. She lowered the phone. She kept it in her hand. She sat in the gallery, and she was not still. She was a particular kind of not still that was different from anxious. It was creative, not still, the restlessness of a person whose mind was always working on multiple levels simultaneously, always thinking about the frame, always thinking about the story, always constructing the narrative that would emerge from whatever was currently happening. She looked around the courtroom with the assessing eye of someone who was seeing it as a location, mentally staging it, thinking about the light. When her name was called, she moved to the front, and she carried with her something that was almost physical in its presence. Not arrogance exactly, more like a frequency. A vibration that came off people who had spent years being at the center of enormous amounts of attention and had internalized that centrality so completely that it preceded them into rooms. Judge Caprio was not immune to noticing it. He noticed everything. He just did not respond to it the way most rooms did. He greeted her. He asked how she was doing. She said she was honestly amazing. Thank you so much for asking. She loved the city. She said it warmly and genuinely, and with the ease of someone who had learned to generate warmth at scale without it feeling manufactured, which was its own significant skill. Judge Caprio said he was glad to hear it. He looked at the file. He took his time. He always took his time. He asked her about the first parking citation. He asked her to tell him what had happened. She said she had been filming in front of a beautiful building, and her driver had pulled up to give them the best angle, and they hadn't realized the zone was restricted. She said it was a genuine oversight. She said they had moved as soon as the officer approached. Judge Caprio asked about the second citation, the one from the following morning, different location, same violation. She said it was a similar situation. She said the locations they were working in were not always ones they could scout extensively in advance. She said the trip had a spontaneous quality that was part of what made it work creatively. Judge Caprio said he understood the creative demands. He said he had a question, though. He asked whether the first citation had produced any discussion within her team about how to approach parking for the remainder of the trip. She said yes. She said they had talked about it. He asked what the outcome of that conversation had been. She said they had agreed to be more careful. He said, and yet the following morning, the same violation occurred at a different location. She said yes. She said she understood how that looked. He said he wasn't concerned with how it looked. He said he was concerned with what it indicated. He said that a conversation about being more careful that produced the same outcome the very next morning was not really a conversation about being more careful. It was a conversation that someone in the group had considered resolved without it actually being resolved. He asked whose responsibility it was to ensure the vehicles were legally positioned during filming. She said it was technically her production manager's responsibility. He asked whether the production manager had been aware of the first citation. She said yes. He said, so the production manager, who was aware of the first citation and had participated in a conversation about greater care, had nonetheless allowed the same situation to occur the following morning. She said that was correct. He said he wanted her to understand that from a legal standpoint, the citation was hers, not her production manager's. The vehicle was registered to her production company, the entity listed on the filing. The person responsible to this court was her. She said she understood that. He moved to the footpath obstruction. He described it carefully. He said the path that had been blocked was a public right-of-way. He said it had been blocked for 40 minutes by equipment belonging to her team. He said a complaint had been filed by a resident who used that path regularly and who had a mobility consideration that made the alternative route a genuine hardship rather than a minor inconvenience. Something moved across her face. Not guilt exactly. Something more like the first moment of genuine contact with a consequence she hadn't previously made real in her mind. She said she hadn't known about the resident. She said she hadn't known anyone had been specifically affected. Judge Caprio said that was frequently the case. He said the people who caused disruption often didn't know about the people who experienced it. He said that not knowing did not change what had happened. He said the path had been blocked and a person who needed it had been forced to find another way, and that had a cost that was borne entirely by that person. She nodded. She said she was genuinely sorry about that. She said it in a way that sounded true. And then she did something that she probably did not plan and that perhaps she had done before in situations that were uncomfortable, reached for the thing that had always oriented the room around her. She said she wanted to give the court some context. She said she didn't know if the judge was familiar with her work. She said she had a fairly significant platform. She said that her coverage of Providence over the past 2 days had generated a substantial amount of attention for the city, for local businesses, for the waterfront, for restaurants and shops. She said she had measurable data on the economic impact of her visits to places and that Providence had benefited considerably from her presence. Judge Caprio said that was interesting. He said he appreciated the context. She seemed encouraged by this. She continued. She said she thought it was worth considering the overall picture of her relationship with the city. She said the value she had brought was real, and she thought it was relevant to how the court might see the situation holistically. Judge Caprio said he had a question. He said it was a simple question, and he wanted a simple answer. He asked her what she thought would be a fair outcome given the context she had provided. She said she thought perhaps the citations could be reduced or waived given the circumstances. He nodded as if this were a reasonable thing to have said, and he was considering it seriously. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked her a question. He said he wanted to understand her platform a little better. He said he was curious. He asked her what the nature of her relationship was with the 18 million people who followed her. She said they were her audience. She said they were people who connected with her content and her life and found value in it. He asked whether she felt a responsibility toward them. She said yes. She said absolutely. She said her audience trusted her, and she took that seriously. He said that was admirable. He said he meant that genuinely. He asked her whether she thought the people who lived on that street, the people who used that footpath, the person who had filed the complaint, were part of the Providence community that her content had celebrated over the past 2 days. She said yes, of course. He said so they were, in a sense, part of the story she was telling about the city. She said yes. He said, and yet one of them had been significantly inconvenienced by her team's equipment for 40 minutes on a Tuesday morning. She said yes. He said he wanted to ask her one more thing before he addressed the violations. He said he wanted to ask her genuinely, not rhetorically, because he was actually curious about the answer. He said, do you understand the difference between an audience and a community? She looked at him. He said, an audience watched. A community lived there. He said an audience followed her because they chose to and could stop at any moment. A community existed whether she was there or not, had existed before she arrived and would exist after she left, had needs and routines and rights that had nothing to do with her content calendar. He said that when she came to a place with a camera and a team and a production schedule and the implicit understanding that the place existed partly as a setting for her story, there was a risk that the people in that place became extras, background, part of the frame, and that when they became part of the frame, they stopped being people with their own claims on the space. He said the resident who filed the complaint was not background. That person was the main character of their own Tuesday morning and their own life and their own relationship with that footpath and that city. They were not there for her content. She was there in their city. She was very still. He said now. He said he was going to answer her implied question about whether her economic contribution to Providence affected how he saw her citations. He said no. He said it simply, without drama, just a word. He said that the restaurants that had seen increased reservations were delighted. He was sure. He said that the shops that had sold out of products she had mentioned were grateful. He said that economic activity was genuinely good for the city, and he did not dismiss it. But he said that the woman who runs the restaurant and the person who owns the shop and the resident who uses the footpath all lived in the same city under the same laws. He said that the laws did not flex based on how much attention you brought with you. He said that if they did, they would only protect the people who couldn't generate attention, which was a perverse outcome for a system that was supposed to protect everyone equally. And then she asked it. She hadn't planned to. It came out in the middle of something she was saying, a sentence about how she thought the court might see her situation differently if it understood her reach. And the sentence arrived at the question almost by its own momentum. She said, do you even know who I am? The room went very still. Judge Caprio looked at her. He let the question sit there for a moment, not ignoring it, not dismissing it, just letting it exist in the room so that everyone present could hear it clearly and completely. Then he said, yes. He said, yes, I know exactly who you are. He said, you are a person who received 3 citations in the city of Providence and who is standing before this court to address them. He said, you are a person who built something remarkable with your talent and your understanding of how people connect, and he meant no disrespect to that achievement. But he said that in this room, in this moment, that was who she was, not the platform, not the followers, not the engagement metrics or the economic impact data. A person with 3 citations and an obligation to address them under the same terms that applied to every other person who stood in that spot. He said he knew exactly who she was. He said the question she was really asking was whether knowing that changed anything. He said the answer was no. He said it had never been yes for anyone who had stood in that spot, and it would not be yes today. He said that was not a failure of recognition. It was the whole point. She stood there for a moment after he finished. Something in her face was doing something private and genuine that had nothing to do with content or framing or the story she would tell later. She was just there in the room with what had just been said, without a camera or an audience or a caption. He fined her on all 3 citations, full amounts, clearly explained. He addressed the footpath violation with particular care, noting the impact on the resident who had filed the complaint. He was precise and fair, and the process was clean. Before she stepped back, he said one thing more. He said that she had 18 million people who looked to her to show them something true about the world. He said that was an extraordinary thing to be trusted with. He said he hoped she would use it well. He said that the most interesting content he imagined she could produce was not the beautiful building or the waterfront or the restaurant with the perfect lighting. He said the most interesting content was probably the honest version of a morning that didn't go the way she planned. The version where she stood somewhere and got told something she didn't expect and had to figure out what to do with it. He said that version of her was the one 18 million people were probably most hungry for. Not the curated one, the real one. She paid the fines. She walked back through the gallery. She picked up her phone. She stood outside the courtroom in the corridor for a long moment. Then she opened her camera. She pointed it at herself. She said she had something to tell her audience about the morning she had just had. She said it was not what she had planned to post today. She said it was better. She talked for 4 minutes without stopping. She did not use a filter. She did not adjust the light. She said what had happened and what had been said and what had made her think about. She said she had walked in thinking about her platform and had walked out thinking about a resident she had never met who used the footpath on Tuesday mornings and whose Tuesday morning she had made harder without knowing or caring. She said she cared now. She posted it before she got back to her car. By the time she reached the highway, it had been viewed 900,000 times. By evening, it was the most engaged piece of content she had ever produced. The comments were not what she expected. They were not the usual warm affirmations. They were something more searching. People said things like, "This is the most real you have ever been." People said they had followed her for years and had never felt they were seeing her until this. People said they didn't know a traffic court in Providence could produce something that made them feel something. She read the comments in the hotel that night. She read more of them than she usually did. She thought about what Judge Caprio had said about the difference between an audience and a community. She thought about it for a long time. She posted the next morning from the footpath, just herself, walking it, saying nothing, letting the camera show what it looked like in the morning light, the ordinary texture of a thing that someone depended on and that she had blocked without thinking. She tagged the city. She tagged an accessibility advocacy organization she had looked up the night before. She said in the caption that some paths mattered more than they looked like they mattered, and that she had learned that from a judge in Providence who had answered her question in a way she had not expected and would not forget.